impeachment, collusion, investigations, whistleblowers. Keeping up with a list of scandals in this administration attached to this president can certainly be exhausting, but keeping up with this foreign policy reversals, that can also be downright concerning. And for example, there are still thousands of American troops in Syria fighting the Islamic State, keeping an eye on the Syrian government, which has gassed its own people, as you know, in recent years. Now, one part of our mission there to serve as a buffer between two American allies, Kurdish-controlled northern Syria and Turkey, which sees the Kurds as a threat. But last night, Trump changed that mission. After a phone call with the Turkish president, Trump announced that Turkey would invade northern Syria, and the U.S. would be pulling back to let it all happen. In conclusion, that leaves the Kurds, the allies that we leaned on heavily most in Syria, with a bullseye on their backs, and the Turks, theoretically the ones taking aim. Even the president's biggest supporters, they were stunned by the move.
The Kurds will now align with Assad because they have nobody to count on because we abandoned them. So this is a big win for Iran and Assad, a big win for ISIS.
There are a lot of reasons why Trump may have made the decision to abandon the Kurds, but U.S. foreign policy doesn't seem to be one of them. Trump, he has a long-running relationship with the Turkish President Erdogan, seen by many as an authoritarian seeking to expand his power. U.S. pullback in Syria not only helps Turkey, but it also helps Russia, raising more questions about Trump's seemingly whatever relationship with Vladimir Putin. Then there is the situation in Ukraine, which has nothing to do with the phone call or the whistleblower or Trump asking Ukraine to dig up dirt on Biden, at least not directly. Ukraine, which has already lost Crimea to the Russians, is dealing with an active shooting war in the eastern part of that country. Russian loyalists and perhaps even some actual Russian military continue to attack the eastern Ukraine. Now, that is why American foreign aid is so critical to the Ukrainians. But last week, Ukrainian President Zelensky agreed to hold elections in the territories controlled by the Russian-backed separatists. Translation, Ukraine is probably about to lose even more territory. And once again, Russia and Putin will be the beneficiaries. One additional note, a Times op-ed by a former member of the intelligence community, it's reaching out directly to the administration here for abandoning foreign nationals who have risked their lives to help the U.S. in war zones, particularly in Iraq. Now, the author of that op-ed is Philip Caruso. Philip is a fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs, and previously he worked in the U.S. intelligence community and for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Mr. Caruso, he joins us now. Philip, thank you for the time. I want to get to your editorial, but given the recent developments, or at least what was announced, at least the intentions of the administration, I was struck that Nikki Haley, of all, his envoy, said, you do this, you're basically sentencing these Kurds to die. And it's an abandonment of the commitment we made to them. What kind of a message is that sending, not just to the Kurds here, but to anybody who's basically put their neck on the line for us?
Yeah, I agree with Ambassador Haley. The problem is that this is a very short-sighted move. Obviously Trump made a campaign promise to extricate the U.S. from as many places as possible, including Syria, and has tried to withdraw U.S. troops back in December, which prompted the resignation of Secretary Jim Mattis and the U.S. Special Envoy for Syria, Brett McGurk. The message that it sends is going to be problematic for the future for United States national security. I mean, first and foremost, any group that the U.S. Seeks to partner with, any ally, whether it's a small minority group in a given country with which we're fighting terrorists like ISIS, or even states themselves that view themselves as potential U.S. allies, are going to question: will the U.S. keep its commitments? Will it protect us if we do the things that the U.S. asks us to do and take those risks? And ultimately, United States national security depends on allies and partners.
As you said, there's a moral point to this, but there's also a practical point. Forget about what we're doing to these people who we gave our word to. Geographically, explain the significance for folks where Syria is. I mean, in context to our allies, from the Jordanians to the Israelis, etc. What happens in Syria doesn't just stay in Syria.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. So, a lot of folks aren't familiar with the complexity of the challenge there, and it really is complex, and that's why it's so critical not only for the U.S. to have a presence, but also to have strong partner forces. So you've got the fight against ISIS, which is the primary mission. That's why our troops are there and why the Syrian Democratic Forces, the Kurds, are so important. We've been pursuing ISIS relentlessly over the last few years, and that, even though it no longer holds territory, the so-called caliphate no longer exists, ISIS fighters are still there. There's tens of thousands that are believed to exist. And so the Kurds, our allies, and U.S. forces are there to keep that fight going so that ISIS can't attack the United States, that can't plan and plot attacks that happen in Europe and other places around the world. And if that pressure is diminished, which it will be if the U.S. leaves, then ISIS may be able to attack the United States or to attack civilians in other parts of the world. The second major issue is Iran. You have a presence of Iran in the region, especially in Syria, with a focus on attacking Israel and causing problems regionally everywhere. And Iran has been able to gain a foothold in Syria. And if the Kurds, our allies, have no one to turn to as they're pressured and attacked by Turkey, then they're likely to have to cut a deal with the Assad regime and the Iranians, which may force them to help the Iranians move things like weapons and equipment and people closer to the Syrian border with Israel or into Lebanon to attack Israel, which presents a whole other set of issues that the United States should and does care about. And lastly, you just have general instability in the region, right? That as certain areas of the country collapse, you have the potential rise of more terrorist groups, not just ISIS. For example, in Syria, there's the Nusra Front, which is an al-Qaeda affiliated organization that also wants to attack the United States. And when there's chaos from a U.S. withdrawal or from a war between Turkey and the Kurds, you could potentially see the resurgence of groups like that who can then in turn try to plot future attacks on the United States.
And if you are an ally and you look what's happening in Ukraine, there's a transactional part of this that obviously we've talked about ad nauseum here, but there's more than that, where I would assume there's only certain givens in the international landscape, and you've forgotten more than I'll ever know, Phil, but one of those is if the U.S. says they're going to stand with you, they're going to stand with you. And as the big kid on the block, no one's going to mess with you. If you do this and we basically abdicate and let the Russians interfere however they want in Ukraine, who's to say it stops there? To me, the domino concerns of this have to be keeping our allies in Europe up at night.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, going back to our discussion earlier, this sends a message that the United States is untrustworthy, that it won't live up to its commitments. And it sends that message everywhere, not just in Syria or to the Kurds. And so Ukraine, as you mentioned, is another partner of the U.S. In Eastern Europe. It seeks a stronger relationship with the U.S. There are other countries that were formerly part of the Soviet Union, like the Baltic states, that are formal NATO members, as well as Poland, all of which are concerned about Russian aggression and Russian intervention in their own elections and in their own societies. But there's no question that the Russians are watching us. They're thinking about what the United States is doing, not only in Syria, but in Ukraine as well. And when we send the message as a country that we are very much headed for the exits, that we don't want to commit troops or resources or money or withholding aid, etc., you would be emboldened by that. And I think there's no question that Vladimir Putin and the Russian government is emboldened right now. So as we go forward, I would expect to see more Russian aggression and more attempts to undermine democracies and undermine governments in Eastern Europe and around the world, because the United States is not necessarily going to be there to stand against them. And
this brings me full circle to your editorial. And again, I understand there's a fatigue in this country with military involvements that we have everywhere. But this is a different question as to a debate as to whether or not you should be in a fight. Then when you commit to your allies that you will be there for them, and then you pull the rug out, who are we turning our backs on? Put a face on these people.
Yeah, that's right. So pretty much everything the United States does abroad, everything from running an embassy to dishing out visas to processing applications to helping tourists, American tourists, as they travel abroad, all the way up through waging war, we depend on locals in those countries. And these are countries around the world, pretty much everywhere you could possibly go or any place you've heard of. We depend on them to help us to do that job. In the military and the intelligence community, there's many different locals in these countries that do a lot of different things. Some are formally employed as interpreters, as staff at places like embassies. The U.S. military in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, which conflicts Americans that are familiar with, have depended on a lot of locals to serve as interpreters because they speak the local language. They speak it fluently. They know it well. And so you depend on those people to help you. And when they do that, they take risks. Now, on the op-ed, and there's a subset of those people that I think are particularly vulnerable, and those are the people that work for us in intelligence capacity. People that have a relationship with the U.S. government where essentially what they're doing is they're collecting information, they're spying, they're taking risks on behalf of U.S. national security, and they're putting themselves at risk to do that, right? If they get caught by one of our enemies or a terrorist group or somebody who's being, potentially the target of U.S. efforts, they're in most cases going to be killed, and others imprisoned. And we've seen that in conflicts historically. And so I believe there is a moral and ethical imperative to do something to help those people. When the United States makes a decision to leave, regardless of what you think about that decision to withdraw, for example, from Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, we have an obligation to those people. We have a duty to live up to those commitments that we made. They took risks for us, and we have to do something for them in return. And it's not just a quid pro quo while we're there, where we may be able to pay them a salary or give them some money or whatever. Their lives are at stake. Their families' lives are at stake. And so if we're going to leave, I believe we do have an obligation to try to help them to get to a place where they can survive and have a fruitful life afterwards, which includes the United States. My op-ed, and I would reiterate this call now, I call on the government, on the Trump administration, on Congress, on whoever will listen, honestly, to just do as much as we can to help those people, especially those people who have taken the most risks for us.
And I should note here, what Philip is speaking to, it's bipartisan. This is not a Democrat-Republican thing, especially when you look at some of the military voices who have called out for this. They believe it is the right thing to do. And just like we started, there's a moral part to this and a practical thing. People in conflicts down the line won't trust us anymore because they'll look at past conflicts, and if we turned our back on people and allies, it's going to happen all over again. Philip Caruso, I really appreciate the time. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, when we come back, we're going to tell you about some stories that I bet you most of you haven't heard. I know while the government's certainly focused on impeachment, it doesn't mean the administration isn't doing things that I think will shock you. It has to do with everything from making sure the food you eat is safe to even being able to get emergency care in the friendly skies. Stay with us. We'll be right back.